Hello and welcome to Resilient Living TV. This is the place to be when you're ready to create a remarkable life through change and resilience. Today, I have a very deep conversation with a very interesting person that we crossed paths before and we reconnected online. So I've been on his podcast and I could not resist having him on mine because his story is amazing. So I hope that you enjoy this and you can get some benefit out of it. So his name is Rick Amitin. He's an ordained minister. He's an author, a contributing columnist for Read My Mind magazine and other platforms. He's an inspirational speaker and the founder of rickamitin.com and the host of Rick on Life. Now, he's traveled extensively as an evangelist and pastored several churches. He's before embarking on this journey of transformational life coaching, but he's also a certified behavioral analyst with the Institute of Motivational Living. And Rick believes that determining why we do what we do is critical to effective positive change in our individual lives. He is also married. He's a granddad and a grandchild on the way. So I'm going to let him ad-lib on that. And thank you for joining me, Rick.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate being here with you.
Yeah, this is so wonderful. The first question I want to ask you, but first of all, do you want to add anything to your intro?
Yeah, I want to tell you, I am a great-grandfather, and the baby that you were mentioning that was on the way is here. He came
awesome.
2 days ago, and so I actually have a third great-grandson.
Awesome.
I'm thrilled about it.
I bet. That brings so much joy to your life, doesn't it?
Yes, amen.
Yeah, I'm a great aunt. So, I mean, wow, that just blows me away, just watch the generations just blossom. Well, thank you again for being on my show. I just couldn't resist. I mean, our lives parallel a lot, we were discussing.
Yeah.
And, it's so good to have a male perspective on some of the things that I talk about. So we're going to talk about fatherlessness, and we're going to focus on your book, If Only I Had a Dad. So first of all, tell me why you decided to write this book.
Well, the good thing for me is I was very clear on why I wanted to write the book. Of course, the writing process, as you know, is challenging.
Yes.
And there were so many things that I was dealing with that that ended up healing my life in the process of writing, and so things kept changing for me.
Uh-huh.
But the reason that I was wanting to write the book is because I realized when my grandson was born, his father had chosen not to be in his life. And so I knew immediately that he was going to deal with the plight of the fatherless. And I was upset about it because I had recognized for a long time that I was affected, from my childhood, from the fact that I didn't have my father in the picture, and I had 3 stepfathers by the time that I was 9. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of upheaval, transition,
yes.
Instability, and I had feelings of being unwanted and unworthy that were very, very deep.
Yes.
And so believing that this was somehow showing up as something that was repeating itself in my family, I really wanted to break this cycle. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to respond to my grandson in a way that was going to minimize his pain and try to be all that he would need me to be from a male in his life.
Yes.
And so I wanted first off to heal my own life, mm-hmm. and I wanted to understand that healing. Secondly, I wanted to clear a pathway for him, mm-hmm. and all of my grandchildren. But he was there with me in my life that was propelling this. And then, of course, I wanted to give what I had learned uh, to others who
Yeah.
are on their own search. And so that was the real, three major reasons I wrote the book.
Okay, so it was very effective. I know in my own journey, writing was very therapeutic.
Yeah.
When you use that along with therapies like repeat exposure, that really helps people to get over the shock and the trauma of their experiences, so that they can see from a different perspective, and they can reclaim what has been taken from them. And also, people don't understand that,
The
trauma
roots.
can be, yeah, they're rooted, and they can be generational. I know they were generational in my family. So when you are the person that can break that cycle, that can really change the course of the future generations. So what you're doing is going to help a lot of people.
Yeah, one of the things that I discovered that just really affected me was that it wasn't only the answers that I was discovering, but
Mm-hmm.
it was also the questions that formed.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that there were these nagging loose ends that weren't attached that just plagued me.
Yes.
And actually being able to form the right questions made the easy answers much easier to discover.
Yes.
It was the questions that really became, even more than the answers, it was the questions that became more powerful to me in the
Yeah.
process of writing the book. Things started making sense.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about the why. I actually started understanding why I did things. And I had been seeking answers, but because I didn't have the right questions,
Yeah.
it was very difficult to come up with the right answers.
Yeah. Because we don't know what we don't know.
That's right.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
Well, along with this, when we were talking before, I was just really kind of, intrigued. So I was looking up some stats about fatherlessness here in America. So here's a slide that shows you some of the stats that I want to discuss with you. Okay, so 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. That's 5 times the average. 90% of all homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes. That's 32 times. Okay. 85% of children who show behavioral disorders come from fatherless homes, which is 20 times the average. And one more, 80% of rapists and anger problems come from fatherlessness homes. That's 14% of the average. And this slide shows you where the sources come from. But I know that what you are doing, your story, even though it's not a nonfiction book. It's based on your life story, but it's creative nonfiction. So it's telling your story, but it's giving someone the basics to move forward in their own life. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, and I agree. These numbers are absolutely staggering. And what I realized is that fatherlessness is actually pandemic, and in this country, but also worldwide.
Yes.
But my story was I was born, and I because of the brokenness, I had this sense of being unwanted. And I need to clarify here that I didn't necessarily feel unloved,
Mm-hmm.
but I felt unwanted. I was often a burden to people who were asked to care for me, besides what should have been my mother and father. So my extended family, they had their own lives, and they were trying to have their children and their families, and I was often thrust upon them. And so even though I knew they loved me, I couldn't deny the obvious intrusion that I was on them. And I felt that.
Yes.
And then my mother having these broken marriages, I had no stability. And so I often, refer to people that I feel like a refugee because I had no home. And so that anchor that so many people have, I didn't have that. I was introduced to God very early on, and so I had this religious component in my life, and some of that stuff that was given to me early on was not correct, and it was erroneous, but it had roots, and it also left me feeling very ashamed.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was, of course, molested. I say, of course, I mean, I talk about this, but I was molested early on, and that that opens up all kinds of things that you're not prepared for.
Exactly.
And so I had, I went into adulthood with arrested development. I couldn't do intimacy. Sex was no problem, but intimacy was a real problem.
Yeah.
And so, I, over time, these layers started forming in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And, at 15, I struck out on my own because I just couldn't deal with the anger and the violence and stuff in my home. And so, I never really lived home again after that, stayed with extended families, and until I went into the service and then spent time in the service, which, only reinforced my hypermasculinity.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was really gaining, all of these negative things that I really didn't want. And yet I had a good heart. I wanted to love people. I wanted to be a good person. But things started manifesting as dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
And even after I got into the ministry, I learned to conform, but I didn't learn to heal.
Yes.
And there were things that stayed with me even as a minister. And I mean, there are thousands of people who will attest that I helped them and benefited, them in their own journeys and their searches and their lives. And yet I was living with a hole.
Yes.
I was living with this stuff that just ate at me, and it didn't make sense. And I would make progress, and then it seemed like I would digress, and until eventually I violated my own conscience, and I did some things, some major decisions I made, and I was unfaithful to my wife, and this brought everything into my marriage and everything into my family that I didn't want.
Yes.
And it was easy to say, it just shouldn't have happened, and then so what do? Are you going to just discard your life and throw it away, and go into to isolation and all of that? But I just felt this compelling to continue to move forward, and I was having a hard time believing that the God that I knew or understood was who he really was. I always felt he was something different
Mm-hmm.
than the pictures and images that I had been handed and held on to.
And and unfortunately, I don't mean to interrupt you, but
No.
that unfortunately happens to many of us, because I remember the fire and brimstone kind of preaching that a lot of the deacons and pastors of churches that I attended. And I just felt, when I told my mom what happened to me, that who would love this dirty, nasty little girl? Because that's how they made me feel. I feel like God, could not even want me on his, near him. And it's just sad that people would want to uphold those kind of teachings in religion, but
Well, yeah, and I was a product of that same environment, and not only a product of it, I became a proponent of it. And it was really my own discovery of realizing that there's something was not right, and so it just wasn't lining up for me. And so I just resigned and moved away from that, the only religion that I'd ever known, and one that I had been ordained in and cultivated a ministry in. And, I recognized that I reached a level of success where you're not supposed to have these problems.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't supposed to be any of these issues. But I also realized how dishonest all of that really is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to confront my own realities.
Yes.
And in that process, I discovered God to be completely different
Yes.
than I thought that he was. He's not angry. He's not out to revenge, or he's not seeking retribution. He is unconditional love. And so for me, I mean, it seems that you're not supposed to, I'm not supposed to have this story to tell, but this is my story. And I'm not ashamed of that. Because of where I am, and where I ended up. It's such a wonderful place that I'm in. We healed in our marriage, and there's just so much. But really, for me, it wasn't until now I had been contemplating my grandson being born for 9 months. I was in the delivery room when he was born,
Mm-hmm.
and when I had played out in my mind how I was going to ensure that he got a red carpet reception and an introduction into the world. So
Yes.
when the nurse, had prepared him, and they were still dealing with my wife, I mean, in all, I think in most every situation, the mother is the first one that holds the baby when the
Yes.
nurses are finished. But she was having some difficulties, and so they were still working with her. And so I had been hovering over the nurse, watching her with this little baby, and waiting for the moment, to hold my grandson. And because she was being attended to, I had the opportunity to hold him.
Awesome.
So for me, I think it was divine design. My daughter hates to hear that, but when I got him, I used every word that I knew to bless him every way that I could. And I mean, I was weeping. And
Oh,
I recognized in that moment, for the first time at 52 years of age, having already been in ministry for 30 years,
mm-hmm.
I realized in that moment, as I poured my love out on that little baby, how God actually felt about me and everyone else.
That's beautiful. That is
And
absolutely beautiful, because you know what? If we have no basis to truly understand unconditional love, or love when it's just so strong and powerful, and it's overwhelming, when we can't relate to that, it's hard for us to have a belief in God.
yeah, and it's just my personal opinion here, but I think that we get our first glimpses of God from our fathers. And so when they're not there, or they're there and they're unavailable,
Mm-hmm.
or they're there and they're abusive, we have a problem when it comes to God.
I think so too. Because we refer to him as Heavenly Father, and that we it's a man. We usually think of God as a man, when really God is androgynous.
Yeah,
Because
he's male and female. He's spirit, but we
yes,
see him in relation, to the world as creative,
yeah,
as the creative force behind the world.
yeah. So your story, what do you want people to take from your story, from your book?
Well, first off, I looked at my own life, and so each chapter addresses an issue, trying to link them together throughout the book. And so affirmation was a big deal for me,
Awesome.
and gaining our identity was a big deal for me, and getting rid of that um, feeling and sense of unworthiness,
Mm-hmm.
which went all the way to my core.
Yes.
And then, so I want people to realize that you can father yourself in the absence of a father.
Reparenting. That's what I talk about. Reparenting. Yes.
Yeah,
Self-parenting. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and you can affirm yourself
Mm-hmm.
without it crossing the line into narcissism or some unhealthy aspect of affirmation. And your identity um, is something that only us as individuals can own. There's
Yes,
nobody who can give that to us.
exactly.
We have to resolve issues of identity for ourselves. And so living with a sense of worthiness is one of the things I hope that people can gain. And I want them to see throughout the book and through leaving my warts in and talking about some of the, the less than desirable experiences of my life that were painful and brought pain to me and to people that I loved and my wife and family. And you disappoint other people, and sometimes it's not fair, but they experience it, and so you feel their disappointment. But throughout all of that, it is getting to unconditional love that creates a foundation that won't be shaken by the rest of the experiences of your life. So that's the things that I hope people get from the book.
Yeah, because we have to understand that, again, if you don't have that experience of feeling love and knowing love for yourself, it's hard for you to be able to truly express it. So if you can't begin with yourself and loving and healing and nurturing and caring for yourself and inspiring yourself and all of those wonderful things that I consider a component of intimacy, having that intimate relationship with yourself and truly loving yourself and seeing yourself as this person with so much potential and so much love to give and to receive love. Until you can really put all those pieces together, life will continue to be difficult. Because when you mentioned something about how you felt as a child. Boys from as young as 4 years of age are constantly pushed in the more physical expression as opposed to emotional development anyway. So on top of the trauma and on top of everything that you were dealing with, you had, that part, pulling you into this, ultra masculine kind of things. And if men can understand that, if they are feeling this disconnect, this feeling of not having a voice to really communicate what they're feeling, what they're going through, what their thoughts are, then they need to look at their emotional development and what's at the core. Is it because my father wasn't there? Is it because I was abused? What was it that really make you feel this way? Because we don't come out feeling these feelings. We come out naturally loving and caring and all of this stuff. So I think your book is on point. I think you're going to expose people to a lot of things, and it's going to be wonderful to see people reach out to you and say, hey, this I think I'm going through the same thing.
Yeah, the way things play out, again, it's the questions. I know with men and working with men, a lot of times, well, they don't, first off, it's difficult for us to talk about the deeper, intimate things.
Mm-hmm.
And so they need a safe place to be able to talk about these things. And they also need to realize that they're not alone. This is far more common than,
Mm-hmm.
than they think. But secondly, the way these kinds of things play out is because I went through these broken home situations, before I was 9 years of age. I really, not consciously, but subconsciously felt like things weren't going to last.
Yeah.
And so I got married, and, I had a habit in other areas of my life of feeling like they weren't going to work out. So even though if I worked really hard to create something through those hyper masculinity channels, I would oftentimes then undo them psychologically because I didn't think they were going to last anyway.
Yeah. Sabotage because of abandonment.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, to be able to be sitting here now, having gone through, it's been years ago, of course, but I mean, decades, we're on the other side of, our marital traumas. But the fact that we're here, in a 36-year marriage, and that we're happy and that we love each other and we've got great respect for one another, and, our lives are healed up. I mean, there's great hope for people who want to resolve the issues. It's simple. It's just not easy.
Yes. Yes.
We're not as elaborately screwed up as we think we are. Wisdom is very simple, and we can apply just simple principles of wisdom, and we can unravel these knots in our lives. We can unravel these emotional knots, these mental knots, these even spiritual knots. We can unravel them if we want to.
Yes.
And as you know, the pain of where you are has to become the pain of change. The pain of staying where you are has to become greater than the pain of change, or
Yes.
you won't change. So
Exactly.
when you decide, I don't want to live this way, there are answers, and there is a way forward, and there is light to shine on, on the cold, dark places in our lives.
Yes.
And we can reach. We can reach these places of being at peace and satisfied and complete and whole and empowered to be who we are.
Yes. And you also do coaching. So tell us about some of the programs that you have.
Well, I'm actually I've backed off a little bit from coaching with the development of the TV program, but I'm really in the midst right now of creating some online training. I love your platform and the presentations that you do, and it really inspired me. I've had these thoughts and desires for a long time, so I'm really putting together the training modules
Awesome.
to make it more readily available and financially feasible for people to jump on these segments, these modules, where we deal with the actual chapters of the book, the affirmation, the being unwanted, the sense of worthiness, the gaining identity, the real picture of unconditional love. But now I did, along with my book, I created a companion workbook.
Awesome.
So, and I'm willing to give that to your viewers for free. So if they get the book, read the book, then they can go to ifonlyiHadAdad.com, www. IfonlyiHadAdad.com, and they can download a digital version of the workbook.
Awesome.
And the workbook is laid out chapter by chapter, and what I expose in there are the strategies and the things that I did that helped me resolve these particular issues. And while I think we have a lot of commonality in our human experiences, we certainly have our different elements of story. And so someone's story may not be exactly like mine, but I tried to do the workbook in a way that would allow for all of those individual stories to find connection.
Yes.
So I really encourage people to take advantage of the workbook. And if they'll take the time to go through it, and if they'll find the honesty and the courage to do the actual work in there, they'll take a major step forward in their life.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. And I thank you for all the listeners and viewers so that they can, step into, healing and moving forward in their lives. So thank you so much. This is awesome. Thank you. I wasn't expecting the free gift. That's a bonus.
I think well, you're generous. You know how it works, and you need to get this stuff isn't ours to keep anyway. I mean, we have to make a living, and we have to monetize our work, but finding places to just be generous and give back is not going to hurt us in any way. And I'm more concerned about the people and their individual lives than I am about anything else.
Yes. And it shows definitely. So Rick, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to put all of your information down below underneath this video and podcast so that if anyone wants to connect with you, you can find his information below. Thank you so much for all that you do in this area to help people heal. And thank all of you for listening and watching today. And I will speak with you again next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.